Hi guys, welcome to the OSU Museum of Art. I am super thrilled that you guys are here to join us for this amazing talk. I know it will be an amazing talk with Rebecca Drolen. Before we begin, I just want to remind anybody who's not picked up one of our season brochures that we have them on the back counter, so grab one of those to learn more about the exhibitions and programming happening this spring. And also I wanted to let you know that on March 2nd, we're doing our reception for all of our spring exhibitions. So all of the exhibitions on view will be celebrating at once this time. I hear there will be wine and really good hors d'oeuvres to sing. So that's something absolutely to come up with. So I'm so glad that you guys are here to welcome Rebecca Drolen. This is a really exciting chance for us to learn more about Rebecca's work and insights into the world, right? So thank you. And I really want to thank Professor Andy Mattern. I learned about Rebecca's work from Professor Mattern after he raved about seeing her at a conference. And so thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. Rebecca is working with Andy's class, Professor Mattern's class, to create an installation in the art lab. How many of you, raise your hands, are part of that creative process? Very nice, good job. So that will be installed tomorrow, and everybody in the community on campus is welcome to come and interact with that, so I hope you do. Rebecca Drolen's photographic work explores portraiture and constructive narratives using elements of truth that a photograph carries in order to validate scenes. A discussion of how individuals assemble their identity is paramount to her work. As you'll soon learn, she has a particular fascination with hair. I do love that. Rebecca received her MFA photography from Indiana University in 2009, and before joining the art department at the University of Arkansas in fall of 2015, she worked with several institutions, including the University of Georgia, Michigan State University, and Belmont University. Drolen's photographs have been shown in group and solo exhibitions on a national and international level within noteworthy venues such as the Huffington Post, Oxford Americans' Eyes on the South, the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, Texas Tech University, CICA Museum in Gimpo, Korea, and the Theory of Clouds Gallery in Kobe, Japan. Drolen has had work published in various art magazines and blogs, and has worked in private collections as well as in the permanent collection of McNeese State University in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Please welcome with me Rebecca Drolen.
Thank you guys. So I'm going to somewhat awkwardly start back here, but I'll find my way out to the front in just a minute. I have a few notes to follow up, but I want to echo thanks to Professor Mattern. It's hard not to call you Andy, but Professor Mattern for bringing me out here. It's been really fun to get to work with the students, so thank you guys for being on board for what was kind of a wacky proposal of a project, and I think the end result will be really exciting. And thank you to Carrie, I lost sight of Carrie, but for helping with so many logistics and supporting the visit. So I'm just incredibly grateful to be here. It's also wonderful to just have physical recognition of how close where I'm located, University of Arkansas, is to Oklahoma State, and I think we need future collaborations. This is really good. So I'll dive in, and I definitely want to talk in light of the Pictorialism exhibition that's going on right now, because it's such an amazing body of photographs. But first, I've titled my talk Ponytails and Souvenirs, and so maybe I'll begin to demystify what I mean by a souvenir, because I think that this has a relationship to the pictorialist photographs that are on view as well. And so this idea of converting experience into an image, a souvenir, is pulled from an important book by Susan Sontag called On Photography. And there's a moment where she's referring to travel and talking about our urge when traveling to collect images as souvenirs, to change that experience into something keepable, a keepsake. And so that's something I've always been really drawn to, even though I know my work is different from that intent. But I think what I'm really interested in is if I can cause something to happen for the camera and then use the image as this permanent record that indeed happened, then I have my souvenir of this almost non-event. And so we will see that at play in my work, but I want to argue that this happens within the pictorialist photographs as well. And so pictorialism at large is a movement in photography that I think when I was a student and first exposed to it, I was like immediately enamored with, and then later on my relationship became more complicated to it. So the romanticism, this sort of narrative quality, the handwork, it was all their purpose to prove photography as an art. So in a lot of ways they were mimicking the subject matter of painting, inserting the hand, and trying to overcome the nature of photography, which is that a machine makes it, and then it was extra complicated in their time period as Kodak came out with the first easy, accessible cameras that the phrase was, you press the button and we do the rest. So it was literally a child could do it. And then where does that put art? If they've worked really hard to say that this is an expressive artistic medium, but suddenly a child can do it. We start to see this struggle of the pictorialists. And so the images are remarkably beautiful, and we can see how they reach to painterly subjects. But there was this impending shift that happened where the pictorialists from within started questioning this look to other mediums. So on the left, these are two photographs by Steichen. One is in the collection. The other, this Flatiron Building, is one of his most famous works. And so the Flatiron Building represents the pictorialist view, right? It's of a certain handmade process. It's tinted and painted. It's soft, atmospheric, and incredibly painterly. And then the shift is represented in this lotus flower where it's sharp, It's so easy in this era of photography to kind of explain away and feel that the images are soft and fuzzy because maybe they had worse cameras than us or something, But that's absolutely not true. They had cameras that were precise, that were immaculately sharp, and so they were artistic choices being made. But they turned their theory of how to prove photo as art on its head with the introduction of modernism. And from within, led by Alfred Stieglitz specifically, they moved towards what a machine can do as being the utmost essence of photography. And this sort of distinct shift in language I find really exciting and very easy to liken to what's happening nowadays. So I give this introduction to say that in contemporary photography, where I locate myself, there are all of these people reacting to the digital photograph and running the other direction, doing some of the earliest processes in photography, wet plate, some of these same processes gone by chromate and platinum, and it's a huge movement in contemporary photography. And I feel that it's the same reaction to digital photography being very accessible and easy sometimes. Like an amateur can pick up a camera and make a great photograph. And so this contemporary kind of parallel I find really interesting. So here's just a couple more of Steichen's, the sharper apples, and then even at this later time period, employing the soft focus on these hands. But I couldn't resist showing the hands because hands show up in my work a lot, and this is just a beautiful print that's on display here. Yes? Yes. Yes. And then last I show another print that's on display here by Anne Brigman, because I think this one makes the bridge to my work in the best possible way. So she was a particular pictorialist who maybe was a little more sort of countercultural to the others and was exploring themes of almost this female power in a sort of ritualistic or almost pagan way. So there's often this nude female in a natural space, and then she's handworking the prints. But I find the sort of performative and narrative elements of Anne Brigman's work to be really exciting and something, again, that at my sort of like early introduction to pictorialism, I found really compelling and powerful. So the emotional intensity, the storytelling element of her work, I think ties through to what my approach was somewhat built within. So, you know, my complicated relationship, of course, comes in the fact that they were trying to prove photography was art by looking at other mediums, but I think that was a problem that resolved itself, and then we have these artifacts of these beautiful prints. So I love that the exhibition shows a little bit of both sides. I think that's great. Okay, so I'll launch into my work, and I'll kind of bring in a little more Sontag, and again point to like why photographs interest me. Some of the students saw today that sculptural elements and installation elements have kind of been at the heart of what I'm working on now, and I would say that that's always true. But for me, the end result has always been the photograph as the witness or the proof of this thing. And so with Sontag saying photographs furnish evidence, what we hear about but doubt seems proven when we're shown a photograph of it. The camera record justifies. A photograph passes for incontrovertible proof that a given thing happened. The picture may distort, but there's always a presumption that something exists or did exist, which is like what's in the picture. And so when I started applying this to my work that was entirely fiction, I got excited. So how can the camera record justify something that otherwise would have never happened? So in this body of work, it was work that I made during my graduate thesis, and so this is a number of years ago, and I'll move rather quickly, but I was more so finding locations, staging scenes, and trying to dive, yes, ideas about this transition from childhood to adulthood and resistance to that change. So I was just talking to a student earlier about this work where it's kind of approaching adult problems with childish solutions. So if you are fearing something, hiding in a hole is probably not the right solution. But throughout the work, a number of escape attempts came up. I was going to try to come out, but now that I'm attempting the remote, it's not working. So maybe I'll stay back here a little bit longer until I figure that out. With these, the titles kind of pointed the direction of a narrative without over-explaining the narrative. And they were meant to be kind of these little vignettes, these small stories that pointed to a psychological space. And I hoped that even though they dealt with themes of femininity, such as this one, there's a sense of kind of desperation or urgency and sort of fear of the future that could be relatable to even non-females as well. So as an artist, I'll always speak to a female perspective because that is my own. But I hoped that the sincerity of these came through. So this work, I would say, is most effectively inspired by these illustrations by Edward Gorey and a couple other people kind of in that mix. But I was really interested in these dark little tales that sort of in one image tell a story all the time. It's a peek into a world. We know something happened beforehand. We know that everything's going to change based on this moment, but we see this pivotal moment for the figure. And then text was important to me in finding the balance of captioning versus suggestion. And so this, I would say, is more of a caption, but it still leaves this really open-ended story. And I think it's funny, and so I want the work to be funny. So one more, I promise I won't keep throwing too much text at you, but this kind of gets at, and I won't read the whole thing, but this idea of birthing a moment to be photographed, so allowing events to complete themselves so that something new can be brought into the world, the photograph. And so I would say inciting events to occur so that something new can come into the world, the photograph. So the constructed element of the work is kind of where my enthusiasm rests, that something outside of a daily experience could be made permanent, could be suggested. So I warned you the escape attempts come back. There were a few. So this was kind of like my first major work while I was in graduate school that I saw through fully and completed. And then a couple years out of grad school, I began this work that I would say really launched me into what I'm doing right now. So the Hair Pieces series, and maybe I can point to this in an easier way between this work and what I'm doing now. But I would say there was some little element in the work before that launched me to this. And I always feel that that's true in artistic process, that like some little question that's left unanswered in what you're working on now might lead you into the next thing that you should be doing, looking for that loose thread or that thing that opens up into a newer territory. So there was a piece in the particular histories that involved hair that I didn't show you today, but it just kept me asking questions a couple years later, and then I knew I had to explore it. And so the first piece of the project was this one called Hair Tie, and it was kind of just a big experiment where I found this braid in the back of my closet, and I'd cut it off like more than a year beforehand, meaning to donate it. I know that this is weird, and most people would not say, oh, I should put this around my neck, but somehow the thought struck me like a hair as a tie. And so the thought of a hair as a tie is also the thought of like this feminine symbol of beauty becoming a male symbol of power. So there was something there for me that was really exciting. And so this is a wig that I'm wearing. My parents were very concerned when they first saw this that I just hacked at my hair. But what is suggested is something a little more sinister, and again, a little more desperate, but with a sense of humor within that desperation. And so with this as my starting place, I began to really look at where hair shows up, and I was particularly interested in this Victorian era of maybe the birth of photography, and also like a very different understanding of hair. And so I was looking at things like this that were more about spectacle, hair as spectacle, so a circus attraction of the bearded lady, and then this horse with the long hair, and then these just elements of oddity I found really intriguing. I also was interested in like how do I say it? This hypertrichosis, werewolf syndrome, versus even trichotillomania. So these conditions, trichotillomania is an anxiety disorder associated with pulling hair compulsively, so pulling it out. So the growth of hair in unorthodox spaces. And so these, again, just kind of hair out of its element, out of its ordinary space, and our relationship to that is what I'm most interested in. I was also looking at these sort of vintage torture devices, is what they look like, but it's a curl, it's like a blow dryer mixed with curler. So you can kind of see my headspace. There's this museum in Turkey that collects hair samples, so everyone who visits can leave a sample, or I guess just women who visit can leave a sample of their hair and their address, and what a truly bizarre collection it is, and you can kind of see the magnitude of this. So these kind of spaces, and I think it accesses this urge we have where like hair can mean one thing when it's on your head and it's beautiful, but as soon as it's removed, we have this reaction of disgust. And so this is really the territory I was excited about, is that hair can be both beautiful and terrible, and it just takes a slight shift of context. So one more kind of peculiar space that is nearby, the Hair Museum in Independence, Missouri, and she collects oddities, but she also collects these beautiful Victorian wreaths made out of hair. So we'll talk more about the hair sort of crafts in a minute of the Victorian era. But that is, all of the floral parts and pieces are made out of human hair. And then she has other great spectacles like authentic Michael Jackson hair, etc. And then last, of course, I was influenced by advertising, the messages that we both send and receive about what hair is appropriate and what hair is not, and the language surrounding that. So finally free, as though like our hair was shackles. And then this one maybe more directly inspired, the subsequent piece that I'll show you. So lash extension, mascara, dramatic length, etc. These language, this sort of hyperbolic language, started making me think about how to question that line between what is beautiful and what is terrible and good. I hope that this is funny. Good. So we're told to want longer lashes, but at some point that length is going to become terrible, and this is way past the terrible space, right? But I want the image to poke at, well, if this is too far, where is that line, and why is that line the line? And so kind of pushing what should be beautiful hair into the objectionable space is what I'm looking at. And that happens in some of them, but not all. And I would say this one I attempted that, where probably the worst hair I can think of my interaction with is pulling things out of a drain. But then, you know, if I take that terrible moment and make it this beautiful cascade, this beautiful thing that seems to have a life of its own, maybe I can appreciate that hair, right? But this would take a long time to gather. So other images I intended just to essentially have a narrative all their own. So this suggestion here is loose, and I've had, you know, a lot of different reactions as to what this means. Even to the point that someone I worked with many years ago said that her mother used to hang wigs on a wall like this, and it reminded her of that. So, you know, there are these strange kind of stories that come out from a lot of the work as I've shared it throughout the years. So again, I hope you see kind of the space I'm trying to poke at is like how to upend the hierarchy of good hair versus bad hair, and make light of it, make fun of it a little bit, that if it's so embarrassing to have armpit hair, well, what if we can make it graceful? I also was imagining devices, and I'll show you a few kind of sculptural pieces I made along these lines, although this one was meant to be a photograph. So if it goes in messy and comes out smooth, it is the detangler, right? And hair tonic. So I had fun with these, and I was trying intentionally to mix these elements of still life with portraiture. They were all made in the house I was living in at the time, and that was kind of, you know, I think in a lot of ways the simplicity of these frames was a reaction to particular histories that I was making in grad school, the exhaustion of hunting for spaces, hunting for props, and I just wanted to simplify, and the first few images felt really good, simplified, and then after that I realized it's really hard to stay simple, you know, like to only have one or two elements in the frame and still complete a narrative or complete a suggestion became much more of a challenge, but one that I enjoyed, you know, like how few elements can I offer where you still come out with an idea or a story. And so ear hair, you know, is another example of like I intended one thing and then people have told me other things that were like heavier than my implication. So I was just trying to consider if the hair was removed from one space that's traditionally beautiful to create something new, to create these earrings and accessorize, what would that look like? And then I had a close friend say that this reminded them of a friend struggling with cancer, and like how you're given hair from another person to sort of supplement your own lack of hair. So these associations I find incredibly intriguing, and as I have more conversations about the work, it does fuel my mind towards new ideas, and so I always appreciate that. And then just kind of in the surreal nature of the pieces, the thought that things can take on a life of their own, and sort of hair as replacement for what we would expect became kind of an exciting notion. So while some of the pieces question that line between beautiful and terrible, others just kind of throw you into a world where hair is a part of your like daily tactile experience. And I'll show you in a minute that I did want to try to recreate that in the gallery space too, that this element of being in the presence of hair, not just hair photographed, but physical hair, is something I'm interested in. So here's one more just kind of story-related piece. And then this is the only one that really serves as a triptych, but one that I was excited to kind of fudge again, that boundary of what can happen in a frame. I definitely didn't have a braid that was singularly this long, but through 3 frames, a modest frame can become really long. But beyond that, the thoughts that I had just allegorically in this image had to do with Samson and the idea of like long hair as strength, long hair as power. And so if that long hair becomes a trap, becomes a snare, cutting it is both like liberating and maybe depowering in certain way, taking away power. So you're claiming power by control over the situation, but you're also sacrificing something that took a long time. So I appreciate the tension of this, and maybe even just for context, I've been excited that people outside of the art world are interested in these types of pieces. So I've shown this in 2 different salons for a short term that have asked me for it, one in Philadelphia and one in Indiana. And the interest in just kind of like the act of doing the cutting, and I loved having it in that space. I've had these pieces in hair magazines also that maybe have more of an art bend to them, so that crossover into other territories. I've always appreciated that they're interested in me, even though I'm poking at it and making fun, they were still interested in me. So here's some installation views, or one installation view, so you can kind of see the relationship of the pieces. But I'll transition into a subsequent kind of phase of this project was object and jewelry making. This was not something I made, but to just kind of dive back into history, again to the Victorian era, which I think a lot of this was looking back at. Why the Victorian era is called the Victorian era is because of Queen Victoria, who was in power, and her husband died in 1861, and she was in public mourning for essentially the rest of her life, and because she was considerably the most famous person in that culture, it became fashionable to mourn. There was sort of an industry built around mourning and public displays of mourning, so clothing and jewelry. So these jewelry pieces were sort of begun within artisan settings to, you could essentially bring hair of your deceased loved one to be fashioned into a jewelry object. And so again, this, to our contemporary minds kind of has the gross factor, right? Like we're like, oh no, that would be terrible. I don't want that. I don't want to touch that. It's very strange. But I think what started to intrigue me about this was that there's some correlation between how hair outlives the body and how the photograph outlives the body. And so while death kind of takes the body, the hair and an image in similar ways live on beyond this. This is pulverized hair that is kind of glued into motifs and held as lockets. And then the space that I became interested in were these kind of keepsakes that involved image and hair. And so again, it's kind of striking to see these pieces because you see what is presumably the person who possessed that hair, and there's something a little pointed about that, difficult about that in our current eyes. And so these objects still exist, again, because hair is relatively permanent. You can find these even on eBay, and I have looked for things like this on eBay, so I can attest to you, they're out there. But this braiding and weaving and pairing with the images I just was really struck by. And even, I mean, this is bizarre, but again, I like the bizarre baby's first haircut. I don't think we have to go dark to the death factor here, but assembling the first haircut back onto the photograph of the baby, and it's, again, I'm just pointing to a different relationship to hair and perhaps a different relationship to death as well. And so I promise this is the last theory photo thing I'll throw at you guys, but Roland Barthes, another really considerable writer on photography, wrote a whole book called Camera Lucida that was essentially about looking at this photograph of his mother who was recently deceased and seeing her as a young woman and being just kind of confounded and moved by it. So in this statement here, he looks at the photograph, he knows she's going to die, and he shudders over a catastrophe that already occurred. and then makes this blanket statement that whether or not the subject is already dead, every photograph is this catastrophe. And so this may sound dark, but I think it's more romantic than dark. You know, it's a recognition that photography is a medium of a moment that even once you press the button is in the past. And so when we look back at older photographs, we're struck by how far past they are, but that every photograph deals with a little bit of death, I think is more romantic than negative notion. So I responded to all of this, right? So I began making these small jewelry pieces, mostly based in found objects that I inserted image and hair into. So thus the scouring of eBay, as I mentioned before. And instead of mourning a person, mourning the loss of a human, I thought, well, what if we mourn the loss of hair itself? If hair removal is so important and tied to our culture, we remove it and it comes back, and we remove it and it comes back. This sort of struggle, maybe we can make a remnant of that process itself. So I started making these small jewelry pieces that, again, I think they're the more overtly funny pieces, to think of this as a lot of tweezings then nostalgically and romantically kept. It just kind of made me excited. So I, as a novice, attempted these. I think that there are technical things I would have loved to have learned from a master, but I just dove in and went for it. And so both the image and the hair on either side are ones that I inserted, but I did, of course, rely on those found objects. And so I'm still showing these work. I love to show the jewelry alongside the photographs. I probably show the photographs on their own more often. But I'll have these in a show coming up in Philadelphia very soon. And I think they're just a wonderful, you know, even in terms of scale, they're like probably an inch, most of them. They're really small. And so that intimacy, and again, this moment of like having hair in your physical presence, you know, this extra volume. It is a protruding wad of hair coming out with no facing, nothing. So you kind of are forced to really reconcile with the fact that you're standing in front of sort of a small part of somebody's body. For these, for the most part, I did, based on the objects and the content of the objects, I used human hair, whether my own. People started giving me hair, which is very strange. And then there are ways of purchasing hair, both synthetic and human, and I tried to avoid that at times. And then I started making objects that had almost nothing to do with imagery at all, but I was intrigued by the fact that this is really close to being fashionable. But again, like if you saw somebody wearing this at an event, you might be a little put off by the presence of hair, even though their own hair is probably right next to it. So I think that this was territory I would have loved to, and probably still can, explore a little bit further. And then I saw through some of those devices that were happening in the photographs into physical objects in the gallery space. So I made a couple of detanglers just to see what would happen in person. And again, trying to like find these absurd solutions to really normal problems. I even, you know, I wasn't born in the 70s, but I remember ironing my hair as a teenager just because I knew that existed. And so, you know, these kind of rituals have a little air of truth to them, but kind of brought to this level and disembodied, become a little bit scary as stories. Okay, so this work kind of found me some of my first great success in the field, and it got attention. And I'll say that maybe because there are a lot of young photographers here, I really felt like I was going out on a limb with this work, and I think that that's really necessary sometimes. I didn't have a great amount of like references for what I was doing, and I knew that it was strange, but I was just doing it anyway. And then when it was received well, it was really satisfying. And I think that there's not much you can do besides take a risk in art making, right? If you don't, then you're remaking work that you've seen. And so while I have a wonderful amount of touch points, I felt like I was in uncharted territory for myself, and then that risk was really rewarding for me. And